This is the second installment of Why Your Monsters Suck, Knowledge. Let's say you introduce a new, fairly complex homebrew mechanic that your players have never seen before. Or maybe you're introducing a really unique sourcebook monster like Sulkatesh that the players might have never faced before. As presented in 5e, there are very few built-in ways to actually introduce these mechanics without the players feeling like you've blindsided them. The wizard from the last video had absolutely no idea what the ancient red dragon's firepower was beforehand, and felt a bit jaded when it was introduced to them. Understandably so. They had no means of knowing something like this could happen. My first suggestion if you're going to introduce wild mechanics, either from the sourcebooks or homebrew like the last video, is to give them means of identifying these traits, before the fight or during it. In one of my games, me and my co-DM used a system similar to Pathfinder's Recall Knowledge. In that game, there is such a large variety of diverse monster traits that Recall Knowledge is necessary to combat. We turned Recall Knowledge into knowledge checks for 5e. Knowledge checks can be used by any character on their turn to discern traits or knowledge about a creature. It usually comes in the form of raw wisdom or intelligence check, but can be replaced by specific checks like nature, history, or animal handling. The Dungeon Master sets an appropriate DC depending on what the character is trying to glean knowledge of, and the background of the character. A character can only perform a knowledge check once on their turn, without the need to spend an action. A knowledge check is essentially if the Battle Masters know your enemy was designed better and given to everyone. Normally, a player would spend their action trying to use something like the search action to try and identify a trait, statistic, or behavior of the monster. This is far too punishing for a player just trying to learn basic information to engage with the monster. We made knowledge checks free to incentivize the players to use them whenever they could, since there was no real cost. This is just one example of how to do it. Maybe you could make the knowledge check roll a d20 plus proficiency bonus roll to not buff any specific ability score. Maybe you could tie knowledge checks to intelligence only, as that is an often neglected ability score in the system. You don't have to use the knowledge check system. It's just an example that I've used, and it's been moderately successful in my game. What is important is that if you introduce crazy monster mechanics, give your players fair means to identify it. It does not matter what the specific mechanic is, and it does not have to be knowledge checks as long as it accomplishes the goal of informing your players fairly. Knowledge checks, again, are just an example. Knowing this, now the wizard casts Summon Fiend instead of Force Cage, forcing a hellish being to do battle with Yvrace. Or they could go with Haste, empowering the fighter to step toe-to-toe with the Great Dragon. They can even settle on just casting Force Cage. However, if it's dispelled by firepower, the player has much less excuse and would probably say something like, "Oh, I should have seen that coming." Our wizard, fighting the ancient red dragon along with their party, makes a knowledge check about their foe before casting Force Cage. The DC is rather low, probably a 14. They roll high and blow past the DC. Maybe they ask about any special traits in regard to this dragon or the nature of its breath. The DM tells the wizard that this dragon, Yvrace, burns with a fire that sears through magic. Now that the player is making an informed decision, it gives a much more legitimate choice in the matter rather than spamming the typically optimal spells like Force Cage. I would recommend setting a precedent of having a lot of homebrew designs and traits so that when something like firepower comes up, the player is expecting something like it in a meta sense. Here's another mechanic, just to illustrate one of the many ways you could do this. Say you're playing a Monster Hunter style campaign. In that game franchise, you prepare for a variety of monsters, get traps, bait, and study them in the wild. This mechanic doesn't have to be for Monster Hunter specifically. As long as your players have a lot of prep time for fights, this sort of mechanic will work. In the sessions preparing to fight the monster, creature, bounty, or boss, the players can spend money and time researching leads, rumors, and evidence of the creature. Other players can spend their time and efforts pursuing the actual equipment or allies they may need in order to effectively take down this creature. I'm being a bit vague with the mechanical specifics because the numbers could change drastically depending on the setting, but you get the general idea of the campaign. Whatever campaign you would use a preparation-based knowledge mechanic for, half of the boss fight would be preparing for it. Again, you don't have to use a system like the outline I proposed for the Monster Hunter style campaign. It's just one of the many potential ideas. But you can see how it establishes a different type of campaign relative to the first. Maybe the wizard and his gang don't have access to knowledge checks. They have to prepare way more for this fight. However, through their research in the local city's grand library, or asking locals about you've raced in the prior session, they know how the firepower mechanic functions on a broader level. The survivor of Yvrace's wrath probably recount him actively becoming infused with magma before his breath incinerated everything. Any mages that survived to tell the tale would tell the party that their incantations and spells could not hold up to his flames. The knowledge check mechanic portrays the flavor of the party recalling critical knowledge and experience in order to defeat their opponents on the fly. The preparation mechanic portrays the PCs more as a bunch of heisters or perfect planners, executing on a magnificent scheme or a horribly thought out idea. In some instances, regardless of the setting or knowledge mechanic, you should sometimes just let the players know exactly what the special trait of the monster is on a mechanical level. You shouldn't do this all the time, but there are some mechanics and some scenarios where being very transparent about what a mechanic is and how it functions will be for the best. Say that our wizard has researched dragons all their life because it killed their village and their family or something. If they came face to face with that dragon, it would make so much sense for that character to know precise information about that dragon. Even more so if they have wacky homebrew traits like firepower. If the wizard knew what Yvrace's traits were precisely, it could be a very strategic encounter and sell the fact that the wizard was planning for this fight for a very long time. This feels more impactful, especially if other bosses or fights had more limited information. The more knowledge you give to your players, whether it just be handing it to them or them having to earn it through your systems like knowledge checks, the more complex you can make your monsters and the fairer homebrew monsters will be. That isn't to say fights where PCs go in completely blind are bad either. There's a time and place for those as well. If the PCs were fighting tricksters, illusionists, or an especially terrifying creature, it would betray them thematically to give the players a lot of information about them. Say I hype up the dragon early on. If I wanted to sell the dragon's power and awe, I would commit to the decision of giving the party little to no information about the dragon's traits like firepower. This sort of decision may go over fantastically with certain parties, or it may be a buzzkill for others. But it is a viable decision you can make. Giving your parties any level of knowledge is always a decision you are making. GMs are not aware this is a decision they are making constantly. You can see I'm making a variety of choices with the same red dragon stat block to accomplish a variety of mechanical and tonal outcomes. Knowledge is a sliding scale and a tool you can sprinkle in whenever you need or want to. Now you know it's a tool and you know how to use it to enhance your encounters. You have one more option available to you in your toolbox. Thanks for watching. Leave a like, drop a comment for any video suggestions, and subscribe if you want to see more of my content. Follow me on Twitter and TikTok. Next video is going to be a collaboration about magic items. Stay tuned!